مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. مر أسبوعان والنتائج واضحة وقوية. هذه الديمقراطيون بأفضل انتخابات تشريعية قد عرفها أي حزب حاكم خلال فترة طويلة. لم يحتفظ الديمقراطيون بسيطرتهم على مجلس الشيوخ فحسب، بل لديهم الفرصة لتوسيعه، وبينما قد يخسرون النفوذ في مجلس النواب إلا أن نتائجهم فاقت التوقعات. بالفعل يبدو أن الأغلبية الجمهورية ستكون إشكالية ويصعب الإبقاء عليها بحيث يتمنون لو أنهم خسروا. ما الذي يعرفه جو بايدن ويجعله الجمهوريون؟ هل هذه بداية النهاية بالنسبة إلى دونالد ترامب؟ أم أنه مجرد التفاف في طريقه نحو إعادة الانتخاب؟ لمناقشة ما تعنيه نتائج الانتخابات بالنسبة إلى مستقبل الحزبين ورئيسيهما، يسرني أن أستضيف المراقبين السياسيين المتبصرين نورم أورنستين، ميني راكر وجيسيكا تايلور. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, we have just seen the best showing by an incumbent party in a midterm election in virtually a generation. Let's understand what happened, why, and what it means. And I'm delighted to welcome Minnie Racker, Jessica Taylor, and Norm Ornstein to help explain all of this to you, our Middle East viewers. All right, there were hundreds of races, hundreds of campaigns, but for a moment, let's generalize. Was this a vote for Joe Biden or a vote against Donald Trump? Jessica, lead us off.
I think it was more a vote against Donald Trump and the candidates that he endorsed, because, again, midterm elections, a president's first midterm especially, is supposed to be about the incumbent president. We see that history over history over history. And you look at where inflation is, where the economy is, where Biden's own job approval was. This should have been a drubbing. But you had Trump intervening and backing Trump-like candidates that were the weaker candidates, and especially in Senate and governor's races, some House races as well, of course. And I remember watching focus groups, and voters that I heard from, they weren't happy with Biden, but they very much did not want a return of Donald Trump. And I think Democrats effectively painted these candidates as a return of Donald Trump. And of course, you had his 2024 announcement, which has now been made, hanging over the head there. The fact that I think he teased it so close to the election only brought it up again in voters' minds that, again, I think this is just a repudiation of Trump's type of candidates. And he's not reading it as that, unsurprisingly. There are other people that certainly are. But again, he is, I think, the most to blame.
So Jessica says this is a vote against Trump, not so much a vote for Biden. Minnie, what do you say?
I would agree. I would say I was down in Georgia during the election, and from talking to voters, there weren't a whole lot of people who were super fans of President Biden. They said he was doing some good things, maybe with student debt, but on the whole, a lot of people were pretty dissatisfied with him. And the thing is they voted against Republicans anyway because of things like the abortion ruling, because of things, one voter even mentioned January 6th to me. So even the democracy messaging is getting through, I think. And there's just this portrayal of the Republican Party in voters' minds that is just too extreme. So even if Biden isn't the best president ever in their view, they're going to pick him over this party that they find intolerable, and kind of this representation, this ongoing representation of President Trump.
So, Norm, were the Democrats just lucky that they had Donald Trump as a foil this year? This can't be the best news that people weren't voting for them. They were voting against the other guy.
So I would take it a little bit more broadly, Rob. I don't think this had much to do with Biden at all. And frankly, I don't think it had a whole lot to do with Trump per se. It was Trumpism. It was a reaction against a Republican Party that has gone rogue and radical. It was as much a vote against the Supreme Court as anything else, and a vote against Republican legislatures that have taken the Dobbs decision in absolutely insane directions. And I think it frightened a lot of people. And Trumpism also meant, I think, as Mimi said, that democracy was on the ballot in a lot of places. And I think the abortion decision and democracy all played together. This sense that if you let these radicals stay in charge, that democracy would go, and that means our freedoms. And that includes the freedom of a 10-year-old girl who was raped to be able to get an abortion instead of having to carry a child to term. So it's a more complicated than Biden and Trump in this case. And I'd add one more thing here, which is that the results were stunning, as you said at the start. If it weren't for the Supreme Court basically blowing up another part of the Voting Rights Act, that allowing racial gerrymandering to take place, Democrats would be back in the majority. If it weren't for Andrew Cuomo overreaching in New York and a backlash against a redistricting that went too far, and in this case, the court's drawing it back, unlike in Florida, where Ron DeSantis did an illegal gerrymander and the pliant courts let him, Democrats would have enlarged their majority in the House. So all the gains that they made, they're not going to have a majority in the House, but they could have swept the table if it weren't for a series of other events.
If I take together what all three of you just said, it's a rather remarkable analysis. The usual conventional view of American politics is paycheck issues, economic issues dominate elections. But this election seems to be, throw out the rules. This election is about something totally different. Not to say that there weren't many votes about the recession and inflation and tough economic times in parts of the country, but to think that so many people voted on other issues is a phenomenon we haven't seen in quite some time. Jessica, what do you make of this?
I think also I agree with everything you said, but I'd also add in that clearly candidates matter. And that's something we were seeing less and less in Senate races as they become more parliamentary and you're voting for a party and not the candidate. And that's sort of what I thought would win out at the beginning of this election cycle. But you saw weight candidates cost Republicans the majority in 2010 and 2012. But this time they were voting for candidates. It really felt like. And Democrats were able to make their arguments stronger and to paint these other candidates. As Norm said, it's not Trumpism that's really just permeated the Republican Party. And some of them, they needed Trump's endorsement to win the primary. Some of them tried to inartfully pivot back toward the general center in the general election. Some of them did not even try at all. Which again, in swing states is not how you run elections. And there's a lot of finger pointing going on in Washington now for who's to blame for that. And, between Mitch McConnell and Rick Scott, the head of the Senate campaign committee, who was certainly more to kowtow to Trump and different things. So again, I think economic issues were still on people's minds, but I'm not sure that they thought that Republicans driven by Trumpism would be any better to solve those economic issues than Democrats would. And you add in all of the issues that you would have with a, Trump inspired Republicans taking over.
Biggest surprise, look across the country and in the biggest races. What do you look at as being the most unexpected outcome in a big race? Norm, what do you think?
I think at one level, the fact that Democrats lost Miami-Dade County in a big way, the dramatic change that's occurred in this huge and populous county, was a surprise to me, that both Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio was a very weak candidate this time. Val Demings, who ran against him, was extraordinarily strong. That they won big was a surprise. Most of the races that Democrats won, outside of a few House races that were a little bit shocking, you could easily have imagined them winning otherwise. Now, I would say just one other thing, Rob, which is, to me, the most stunning outcomes other than those were the fact that in Minnesota and Michigan, the Democrats captured both houses of the state legislature and all of the top offices. And that's, for Michigan especially, a stunning change. And that's a reflection, I think, of some of the things that Jessica and Minnie have been talking about, that, in fact, we're seeing some of the working class voters going back, and there's a backlash against this Trumpism in parts of the country that really matter. On the other hand, that J.D. Vance won in Ohio shows you that candidates aren't always the things that matter. Tim Ryan, the Democratic challenger for the Senate seat there, ran a pitch-perfect campaign. I'd say probably the best campaign in the country. J.D. Vance ran one of the worst campaigns that I've seen, but he still prevailed. And that tells us that through all of this, with Florida, with Ohio, that party still matters, that in an age of tribalism, people are still going to vote their tribe. And that is something we may see applying in Georgia as well when we have a runoff election for the Senate.
That's what I want to ask you about, Minnie. You're in Georgia, or you've been in reporting from Georgia. Still one more election, the runoff between the incumbent and the insurgent former football player. Now, the Senate has been determined. The Democrats will keep control. How is this going to affect the race? How do you motivate voters when the urgency of victory for both sides is not what it was before?
I mean, I certainly think it'll be harder to motivate voters now that I think for me, the thing that's most surprising is how quickly we knew that Democrats were going to keep control of the Senate, and the fact that now this runoff in Georgia is sort of an afterthought. And I do think turnout is going to drop a lot. But what we're seeing on the Republican side, we're seeing still Republicans kind of go to voters and say, hey, we need to elect the Republican candidate Herschel Walker to serve as a check on the left in Congress. And they're talking about these messages that the left and progressives are putting forth, that sending the Democrat back to Congress would give Democrats 51 members in the chamber, would give them a lot more wiggle room to pass their agenda if one senator like Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema were to hold up some of those more liberal pieces of legislation. Well, if they have 51 votes, they don't necessarily need that one senator who's holding things up. So I think that's going to be the tactic that that both parties use to turn voters out. The question is, will that work? I don't know.
Is it likely, is the absence or the lessening of urgency likely to affect one party more than the other?
What I would say, and this is just my opinion and based on the reporting I've done, is that now that Republicans don't have a chance at control of the chamber, there's going to be fewer voters who are going to, hold their nose and vote for Herschel Walker, who has widely been seen as a bad candidate. He has kind of a history of these allegations of domestic abuse, of paying for abortions for his mistresses while being, vocally anti-abortion in his politics. And when I talked to voters in Georgia, there were a lot of voters, Republicans, people who were voting for the Republican governor, Brian Kemp, who said, Herschel Walker, he's just too extreme for me. He's not doesn't seem like a good person. I don't know if I can bring myself to vote for him. And a lot of those people, I think, during the on election day, they were ready to do it, just to vote with their party, just to keep control of the Senate. And now that I think that's off the table, I'm not sure they're going to be as motivated to turn out and vote for him.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about some of the implications of everything we've been discussing in just a moment. Our guests again today include Minnie Racker. Minnie recently joined Time magazine as the campaign's staff writer. Previously, she was a staff writer at National Journal, and she reported for the Los Angeles Times. Her work covers the intersection of politics, identity, and culture. Also joining us is Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governors editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and she is the senior author of the 2022 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Previously, she was a political reporter for National Public Radio and NBC News. And of course, we are hosting Norman Ornstein. Norm is the emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of America's wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. He's a contributing editor and columnist for National Journal and the Atlantic magazines, and an election analyst for BBC News. All right, let's take a look at two of the most fascinating personalities because they're both likely to be running for president in 2024. How would you describe the difference between Ron DeSantis, the victorious governor of Florida, and Donald Trump, the ex-president whose candidates just took a thumping? DeSantis and Trump. Norm Ornstein.
So Ron DeSantis is going to run as somebody who is younger, smarter, thinner, and meaner than Donald Trump. But the policies are very little different. And that's what we've seen in Florida as well. And DeSantis, I think, won handily, despite many drawbacks. And he may have a legal issue himself ahead that we could talk about with the way he handled asylum seekers from Venezuela, basically kidnapping them and sending them to Martha's Vineyard. But I think Florida voters liked the fact that he was a tough guy. And that's something that Republican voters liked about Donald Trump. What DeSantis has at the moment is none of the baggage that Trump has, and a growing level of support from Republican elites who have turned on Donald Trump. Rupert Murdoch being a key one. The New York Post had a full-page headline that was Humpty Trumpty. Basically, Donald Trump was responsible for these losses. It's time to move past him. The Post, after Trump announced his candidacy for 2024, didn't have a headline, but at the bottom of the page said, Florida man announces candidacy.
Well, we've now entered what's called the lame duck moment in Congress, where we have 2 months between the election and the swearing in of the new Congress people. Minnie, during this period, what sort of politics are we going to see? Are we going to see the two parties coming together for a brief moment to get some work done? Or are we going to see just deepening of what Norm likes to call the tribalism that has taken over in Washington?
I mean, I think, you talked earlier about how this election kind of bucked conventional wisdom. I think one thing that will not buck conventional wisdom is I think it's going to be really hard to see the parties come together, especially now as we're already gearing up for 2024. Yesterday, President Trump made his announcement, and you just saw Democrat after Democrat, Democratic groups already kind of getting ready, getting fired up to fight him as this representative of the GOP. So I don't think there's going to be that much coming together. There's also the usual kind of financial, logistical decisions that have to be made at this time of year. So I think it's just going to be another kind of slog until we really get into the meat of the 2024 campaign, which is coming sooner rather than later and is in fact already here.
Oh my gosh, give us a rest. Don't the American people want a few months off? Don't you think?
At least they moved the Georgia runoff from January, like it was 2 years ago, to December. So it doesn't ruin all the holidays.
There you go. That's the best we can hope for. I'm afraid we ran out of time. I'm going to have to thank all of you, Jessica, Norm, Minnie. Thank you very much for helping to explain what happened in America on our midterms to our viewers abroad. Thank you very much. With all the money spent on pollsters, demographers, and public opinion experts, you would think that elections would be well-scripted events. After all, marketers already know just about everything about everyone. What foods we eat, what TV shows we watch, what shampoos we use. So you would think they would know what candidates we prefer. But despite vast mountains of data about the voting public, elections still produce surprises. And this year, there was a very big surprise. Virtually everyone, every pundit, every talking head, every political know-it-all predicted a clear Republican victory, with the only point of debate being how big. The historical norm for legislative, as opposed to presidential elections, was that the incumbent president's party loses about 25 seats in the House of Representatives and 3 to 4 seats in the Senate. That would have meant a total shift of congressional control from a slim Democratic majority to a comfortable Republican majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Well, that did not happen. It looks like the Republicans may eke out a tiny majority in the House, probably less than 10, and the Democrats will either keep their 50-50 split in the Senate, with the vice president casting the tie vote, or they will even expand their majority when a runoff election determines who wins a Senate seat in the state of Georgia. Who lost? Almost uniformly, the losing Republicans were men and women closely tied to Donald Trump and the campaign to deny legitimacy to Joe Biden's 2020 victory. In Pennsylvania, Nevada, New Mexico, and elsewhere, close races were lost in places where Trump placed a big bet on the outcome. The Democratic victory is even more stunning when you look at who else was on the ballot in statewide races across the country: governors, attorneys general, and secretaries of state, the local office usually responsible for overseeing elections. In almost every case, candidates who were vocal proponents of the idea that Joe Biden stole the election from Trump lost their race. Of course, many things contributed to the Democrats' good showing, from the highly unpopular abortion ruling by the Supreme Court to a general sense of normalcy that Biden, with all his faults, has brought to the White House after the Trump era's 4 tumultuous years. But no objective observer can fail to recognize that voters resoundingly rejected candidates who supported election denial. In my view, it is not a partisan comment to say hooray. That's not hooray for Democrats. It's hooray for the common sense of the American voter. If crime, recession, and immigration are your top issues, that's reasonable. If abortion, civil rights, and healthcare are your top issues, that's reasonable too. But if your political activism is motivated by a distorted, flat earth conspiratorial view that Joe Biden somehow manipulated the deep state into subverting the will of the voters to deliver an ill-gotten, illegal victory in 2020, then I am pleased to see you get your comeuppance at the polls. As Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن تأثير الانتخابات على العامين التاليين من رئاسة جو بايدن، تواصلوا معي رجاءً عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @Rob Satloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك حين شكراً وإلى اللقاء.